computer. So my apologies. You have to use your memories for the previous part there. Apologies if anybody watched the recording. I forgot to hit the record button and nobody warned me for about 30 minutes. So I've lost a bit at the opening there, but bear in mind, there'll be a Ravel tutorial, and most of what I covered is just to the same stuff as starting to use Ravel. So we'll do it again. So John, how are you going there?
I'm getting there. I'm adding the columns for
using the drop down arrow, using the wedge.
Yeah.
Good. Okay.
Yeah, and then I got into, all right, so we've got credit minus interest and spend. Yes, credit.
So you should only have two left over in the A minus L minus E column because you haven't typed in the second entry for interest and the second entry for spend. But if you type those in the equity columns, you'll find that then gets the sums right. And
do I have to use the same names as I used in the banks?
Absolutely. You must use the same names, otherwise Minsky will give you an error. Even if you get the case wrong, like a lowercase I. So you've got to type exactly the same. We are thinking of doing it so you actually have only a single entry, and then you type a plus and a minus in the columns you indicated for. But we haven't introduced that feature yet.
Credit minus interest, and now spend bank.
I think you can copy and paste.
I'm actually, can I say right click? You can copy the flow variables. I'll go across and check the actual godly table here. Not that one, this one. So if I right click, copy. Okay, yeah, so you can do that. I'll just delete this one.
Now, one thing I see different in mine is I don't see those equal zeros in the non-bank.
I made a mistake that I cut something which was actually already an entry. You don't see the zeros up here, like these zeros?
No, in your non-bank PS, in the bank spending row, it says spend sub B equals 0. At least that's what I saw on the screen a moment ago.
Oh, okay. Yeah. What's actually happening there? And I'll show you what I mean. What I mean there in a moment. I'm gonna copy that one and paste it over here. Mano, you told me something I didn't know. But it's not working. Insert flow. Okay. I haven't even seen that command before. I'm not sure what it does. I've got to check and see what that actually does later. Credit, interest, spend. Yeah, okay, interest, that's it. And that's going to be, I see what it is. It's a cascade. That makes plenty of sense. So you can actually copy, as Mano just pointed out to me and I didn't know, you can use copy and paste, and you paste whether it's positive or negative. So that's now made that row consistent. So Mano, thank you very much there. Intriguing. I just don't use the program enough in anger yet, putting models together to actually learn all the features it has. Now the equals 0 there because there's an option set up here under preferences, and we really need to make it table specific. But globally, godly table shows values. So if I click on that's currently checked, if I uncheck it, all those numbers disappear. But if I check it, I see the numbers, and that's great when you're watching an actual dynamic simulation because you can see the amount of money passing through each of those flow transactions. Tarek, did you have a question?
You just answered my question.
Oh, good.
I was asking myself why the tables didn't show the values.
Yeah, that's all. Yes, it's not an option to change it. Again, this is the sort of thing that takes time because if I say to Russell, it'd be great to have the godly table show values to be specific to each table rather than a global option. And my little sentence for him is half a day's work for him to implement it. That's why it takes so long to get these things done. He's brilliant, no doubt about it, but it still takes time to get those features added. So hopefully we will get them all done. So I'll go back to the presentation now for a moment and just run through what I've got recorded there. Where is that? There it is. Okay. So that's the asset, liabilities, and equity. Those are the account names, which I've been through. That's initial amounts, and you don't have to put them in there. You can actually show whether the system can lift it up by its own bootstraps, and I'll show that in a moment by not putting initial values in there. Adding columns, as I've shown, adding rows, and then I've got reserves and exactly what I've done live. Reserves and loans is the two types of assets. Deposits are the only liability. Bank equity is the situation the banks find themselves in. Lending, I'll put lending into one. I'll call credit. Now, credit can be positive or negative. So I'm going to skip over that particular detail. And you've got to type the entries in twice, but as Mano's pointed out, you can copy using the program itself. And then what you get to is what I've shown you a moment ago. So I'm going to go back, just run through this as a recap, and then I'll go to the actual live one that I've got and show the details. One thing I'm not sure that I mentioned here, but I'll show it live now, is that this is using plus for where there's nothing said, it's a plus, and also minus, and minus you put in red. But you can also go to options, and this is both local and global, I think. You can say you want to have it in debit and credit style. If you click on that, it then puts it the way that an accountant would do in terms of debit and credit. So, Oliver, are you a heavy user of debit and credit, or do you not really touch the double entry bookkeeping tables all that much?
Double entry bookkeeping is more accountancy than actuarial.
I know,
so-
I know you're an actuary, but I thought I'd just check. So, because I find
Yeah.
debit and credit really hard to get my head around, but plus and minus is absolutely straightforward. I wish accountants would go across to this, but that would remove a lot of the mystique of being an accountant, I reckon. So anyway, I noticed.
I find
yeah,
using negative for all costs and positive for all benefits is quite useful.
that's a guide. Okay, right. So anyway, so I've got that set up. I'll stick with plus and minus because we've worked out the logic very, very well, and I think it's quite easy to teach to students, unlike accounting. So now I've got these various forms defined, and I've got loans and I've got interest. And the easiest thing to define, with the most obvious thing that has to be true, regardless of your theory of economics, interest payments are equal to loans multiplied by the rate of interest. So what I can do here is just type interest rate. I'll make it interest subscore curly brackets rate close curly brackets. Do that. And now I've got in a complicated model, this could be a variable, but I'll make it a parameter and give it a value of, say, 0.05, which is 5%. And then you give maximum and minimum bounds for something and step size. And what that means is, once I've got it on the screen here, you can use your arrow key or your mouse to change the value. So it's currently 0.5, which is 5%, but I can increase it by pressing the up arrow key and decrease it by pressing the down arrow key. And you can do that dynamically during the simulation, which really is very, very useful. We've always wanted Minsky to be like a control system, so where people can have a set of parameters to control a model and then vary the model while it runs to try to control the model and to show, ultimately show politicians how hard it is to manage an economy. Then I want to have a multiply operation there, and I can simply type the multiply key, and that comes up on screen. Notice there are 3 circles that turn up there and 1 circle on the output from interest rate. So I click on that circle and bring the arrow out and release it. It doesn't have to be on the input. Minsky guesses where the nearest one is and locks to it. So I do that.
Steve,
yeah.
Sorry, Steve, I've gotten behind again. And so I missed how you have, on my screen, I see either godly image of a bank and the red boxes that go with the stocks and flows. Or if I change it to editor mode, I don't see the red boxes anymore. The red,
So you want to, okay. Okay, what you do is right click on the godly table, whether it's the icon or the table view, and you'll see copy flow variables and copy stock variables.
Yeah. And just copy them and paste them onto the canvas? That's
right, yeah. Now that's the way to do it in bulk. we also have notice up here we have variable, VAR. That's actually a menu. You can get a variable, a constant, a parameter, or you get a browser. And we're still working on this feature, but it's very, very useful. Click on browser and you get a window that stays above your window all the time. And you can then click and bring down particular elements individually. So if I click on interest here, then interest gets attached to my mouse and I can place it on the screen. And if I'm now,
sorry, dumb question, but if something's got the same title, because it was entered in both the banks and the non-banks, that's the same icon. It doesn't matter. I don't need
exactly.
Right.
Yeah, it is just you can have as many copies as you like of the word there, but the word itself indicates a specific flow. So interest on the one table is interest on another table. And when we get to the stage of modeling a government money creation, the same term will turn up 8 times. Okay, you'll have 2 in banks, 2 in central bank, 2 in the public, in the non-bank public, and 2 in the treasury. But they're all exactly the same term.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So now I've defined the interest rate. Now I want to have spending by banks, which is the only thing I haven't defined yet. Well, one of the things I haven't defined. And what I tend to argue is that banks spend at a rate which you can measure in years by asking the question, how long do you think bankers would survive if they had no income? And the answer is years. Okay. How long would workers survive if they had no income? The answer is weeks. Okay? So what you can do is you can divide the amount of money by the number of years that it'll take them to go broke, and that is the time constant. And the term which is used in engineering is use the Greek letter tau, and this is one of the great. To me, it's amazing we're the only program that offers this. But if you type the backslash key, and you can see up in text input up here, it comes up on the input window up here. If you type backslash TAU, that's the English way of expressing the Greek letter T, and I then type subscript and B for banks, and I'll now get that, it'll come up with a define window. So I'll call that a parameter and give it a value of, say, 2, meaning 2 years. If they've got no income coming in, they take 2 years before they run their account down to 0. And I'll give a range, say minimum of 5, minimum of 0.5, and a step size of 0.1. Having defined that, I've now got tau B. Now then divide banks by tau B, press the divide by key, drag the wire from banks to the multiply symbol from tau B to the divide by, and attach them. And I've now defined bank spending as being the amount of money in their bank, in their equity account, divided by the time constant. So you got that one?
I'm a little behind, but I can follow.
Okay, good. Now that just leaves credit to be defined. We've only got 3 flows in this model. So I want to define credit, but there's many ways to do it. You can simply just make it a variable. So if I go here and go and choose edit under credit, edit credit, then I can use initial value for it of 0, and I can say like a maximum of 100 and a minimum of, say, minus 100 and a step size of 1. So I'm simply just varying it by changing its value using the arrow keys. And I can do that during a simulation, make it positive and negative. Now I want to have some way to relate all this to GDP. So the simplest thing to argue is that GDP is the turnover of money, and money is the sum of deposits plus banks. So I've got deposits here. I could take a copy of banks and paste that up next to deposits, and then press the plus key. So I'd have an addition to add deposits to banks. Call that money. And attach it. And now I'm going to be Milton Friedman and type, I've got to move these out of the way, hang on. Velocity of money, make that a parameter. Give it a value of 2, maximum of 4, minimum of 1, or 0.5, the way things are going these days. Step size of 0.1. And then I have money multiplied by velocity becomes GDP. There's GDP. A plus and minus key. Multiply key. Multiply the two together. And you have GDP. That's an incredibly simple economic model. I'll just actually change the scale a bit. I'm still only using a tiny amount of the screen real estate. I now bring a graph down. And what I want to do is combine the credit number as an input to that chart, and then have GDP down below it, so I can see the effect of GDP on credit. Now, I'm going to take a copy of that particular plot and place it here, so I've got exactly the same size graphs. So I can put them next to each other and they're identical size. So I can then see what happens to GDP when I change credit. And I'm just going to label this. So right-click and choose options. And this is credit. Which is in dollar, which is measured over years, and this is dollars per year. And then call this GDP. So options. That's no better. Let's see. Okay. And then zoom in and hit run. Nothing happening, of course, but if I put credit dollars inside there, you're getting GDP growing at credit dollars per year given the time to turnover of money. Hit it again, you get more growth. Hit it again, more growth. And then if you go back to the negative credit, then GDP falls. Okay. So it's an extremely simple illustration of a credit-driven economy. I'll just pause it there and notice that hasn't paused. This is one of the bugs I was talking about. I've reported it to Russell, but no matter what I do, it won't stop running. And it's what we call a Heisen bug, because sometimes it happens and sometimes it doesn't. But hit the stop key. That's all I can really do there. And the stop didn't stop it. Oh, okay, there we go. So that's two of those defined. So that's an incredibly simple economic model, but it takes you minutes really to define it. And that's one of the advantages of modeling this way over the nonsense that students get taught in neoclassical thought. They've got to go through weeks and weeks and weeks of learning how to derive models of perfect competition and then scale them up and assume a representative agent. And it happens, even their very first model they build cannot be solved. And they can't simulate it because it's got an unstable equilibrium. Okay. And they don't have a way. If you actually run it dynamically, it'll go off to infinity. So they impose crazy conditions on it, and that means you've got to numerically simulate it. Okay. So it's ridiculous how hard their modeling is compared to what I do, which is actually both more correct and quite simple to do. But there's your basic model, ridiculously simple. I'll just drag this over here a bit. And again, as I said, if you want to move multiple items and they include godly tables, then you're best to click on a matching variable or constant and drag them around on the screen like that. So that's a very simple model. What have I called that? Demo 1. I'll save that again. So I'll go back to the presentation for a moment. So I've done all this bit here. The possibility of 2 negative or 2 positive entries happens here because, rather than debit and credit, we have plus and minus. And if you're paying money down, then deposits fall and loans fall at the same time. So you get 2 minuses there. So that's it. It's that simple. Let's check the chat here. What have I got? Oh yeah, pinch in and out. That's like using the scroll bar on my mouse here. So when I'm here and I use the scroll bar, then I can zoom, and it's ridiculous how far you can zoom in. Okay, this is all vector graphics. So if you want to get in there and precisely work on something, what if I can go all the way into banks? Oh, getting a bit carried away there. I'll go back to normal. Whoa! Oh, that's cute. Okay. But that's pinching in and out is the same as using the scroll wheel on your mouse. Okay. So I've got a fairly basic, but nonetheless, informative model of banking. And what's happening here? So, what I want to look at, we've got, that's what I did. I've got to go back and edit this slide now because I've gone further with you guys in this than I've done so far. So those are your stock variables. Those are your flow. In the past, they were always attached to the icon, and you had to drag them off the icon or right-click them off the icon to place them on the canvas. Now I've made it easier. So a lot of these things are more straightforward in later versions than they are in the original version. And as I've mentioned, what you've got with Minsky is using the stocks to define a set of differential equations. So I go back to the actual live thing here and look at the equations. There I've got interest being the interest rate times loans, money being deposits plus banks, spending by banks being banks divided by tau B, and down the bottom, just looking at the financial dynamics, we've got the rate of change of banks is interest minus spend. The rate of change of deposits is credit plus spend minus interest. Rate of change of loans is just credit, but that can be positive or negative. Rate of change of non-banks is spending minus interest. So it's doing all the building of a system of differential equations for you. And these can get incredibly complicated. But because the Godley table is ensuring that stock flow consistency, they're right, which is a great advantage over standard system dynamics programs. So let's see, I've done all this. So here's the differential equations, and you can export that in text. So does anybody here use LaTeX to do equations? Tarek does. Okay. You've got to be a junkie like us to actually get into that sort of stuff, but we are. So it means you can document a model really easily. And like if I showed you my book, and when you see the book, there's a fair number of equations inside. Most of them are generated by Minsky. I didn't have to write them myself. So I just cut and paste them from Minsky, which makes life extremely easy. So you got stock flow consistency. I've completed this particular model, so I don't need to go through the problem, but we've already defined the flows as well. So I'll go through this stuff again, and you get that canvas. That's the first step of getting lots of flow variables and stock variables. And notice I didn't mention this. I'll just go back a bit. The design of them tells you what you can do. So flows are both an input and an output. Stocks don't have an input because you've already defined them in the Godley table. Okay? So the definition of stocks is already given by the Godley table itself. So you can't have a flow into a stock, okay? And that they have an outflow, and that's what you use to define other flows, other elements in a dynamic model, and so on and so forth. So you get interest is equal to the interest rate times loans, which we've already done. And you define the parameter, and there's multiple ways to go about doing that. I've shown you just typing straight onto screen. And again, that's only Minsky has that capability in the modern programs. Everywhere you've got to use a menu to do it. But you can also click on the variable window here and choose parameter. You then get the form I've shown you. This is showing it in larger size. And one thing I don't make a large use of just because I'm too busy teaching rather than building a model is units. And they're extremely useful because the unit, and I had this chat with JB a couple of weeks ago, if you remember that discussion over whether loans have to grow because of interest payments. Loans are denominated in dollars. Interest payments are denominated in dollars per year. So if you think of the interest rate, that is denominated in years to the -1. Okay. Because you multiply loans, which is in dollars, by interest rate, which is year to the -1, your loan repayments are in dollars per year, that sort of thing. And the unit will keep check to see whether the entire model is consistent. If you make any errors, it's a great way of checking for errors. So Ty is adamant, any model he puts together, he does the unit checking all the way through, and they can get extremely complicated. Mano.
Yeah, so if you put in the units, then the model will check that you're doing
Yeah, the model checks
wrong.
itself. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. There's Russell he's one of my favorite people. I love him dearly, but Jesus, he can be a stubborn bastard. So I want to be able to define units virtually anywhere in a model. He insists they can only be defined in the stocks or the parameters. Okay. So, but that's just him. So I've got to live with that because he's the mathematician, and he says the flow should inherit the dimensions of the units of the stocks and the parameters in which they're based. So you put the definitions in the parameters, and then Minsky will do the logical checking through the whole system for you. Don't tell him I said that. So you can type the interest rate, type 0.02. I've done all this live, and you've now defined the interest rate parameter. And they parameters only have an output again because it's a parameter. Okay. If it was a variable, notice there's a little wedge shape on the, and that's to indicate you can feed something in. So we go back and take a look at that live model again. Where is that? That's the slideshow. There's the model. Okay. So if I hang on. If I hold the shift key down, by the way, notice the hand symbol turns up. You can then drag that around on the screen. So now zoom in on credit. You can see there's a circle on the input and the output. And that means you can take an input to define it, and it then has an output as well. And even ones that I've already defined, you can still see the output circle there. Only one on the parameters and only one on stocks defined in the Godley table. So back over here. So I've now done all this stuff already, placing the multiply key, the circle turning up, the fact you can release near, you don't have to be actually circle to circle, you can release near a target circle and Minsky will snap onto it. And then you've defined your variable. We've also put some plots in there, so I'll go through this quickly. Hit the run. And this is a particular model where I hadn't defined bank spending. So all the money ended up in the bank's account ultimately, which is not what we had so far. And this, again, is a bit like JP's comment last week. What people tend to leave out when they say you can't repay the interest, it's as if banks aren't spending back on the real economy. Now, they are. They're not fast enough necessarily, but once interest flows in or equal to spending out, the system stabilizes. So you don't get that runaway effect of all the money going to the banks. I define spend. I've already done this all live. So bank spend rate, I'll type that in. Text window popping up. This is just a reminder what we've been through live. And then place that on the variable on the canvas. And that again is the browser table I mentioned beforehand. And you can keep it open indefinitely and just place variables on the canvas as you go. So we now run the model and you see what I went through a moment ago. And that shows that particular model is sustainable and also that credit plays an essential role in driving the economy. So here I base lending and repayment on, I think, on GDP, got velocity. I've done all this stuff already, so I'm going through very quickly. And you then get the same thing I've shown a moment ago. You vary the rate of lending or repayment, you vary the level of economic activity. And even that is outside what neoclassicals understand. So they try to pretend that won't vary GDP. And this shows money matters. And what I haven't done at any stage that applies to the models I've done so far is talk anything about reserves. So they think banks lend reserves out, okay, which they don't do. Well, what reserves are used for basically two functions: transfers between different banks. So if I'm working at the level of an aggregate model of the economy, that particular feature or function disappears. But they're also used as the conduit for government spending, and that's what I want to show now. So let's go back to that set of tables. And again, I've gone past the model here, and I'll just drag that out of the way, put that over the other side of all the Godley tables here and bring them over here. So I've now got private credit I've covered, but I haven't covered government spending. So I'm going to push my luck here. This might not work. I'm going to try to type deficit spending. So tax spending minus taxation. And it does work. Okay. It's just text. So if I type in here, I'll call it deficit. It's actually fiat. So I type it there, and I'll then have to type the balancing item here. Okay. So that works. Okay, that wasn't working last version of the model. It hasn't updated this window yet, and it should have done it already. So I hit the recalculate key. Column deposits has mismatched entry. That's probably because we haven't got it showing up here. So I'm going to double click and bring up this window. And this is a bug at the moment. So Minsky should automatically update this table, but it hasn't done so. So what I do is I click on one of the plus keys and it does nothing at all. I should have brought across the deficit spending. Why has that not happened? Because that error message, I imagine. I'll bring this up, open up this table in the Godly table view. It hasn't actually typed it in. Oh, there we have spending. Okay, so now it's turning up there as deficit. And if I go across to the other Godly window, I'll just delete that extra row that I typed in there. Let's go back and see the other one. Press the plus key here. And now it's turning up here as well. So you're seeing deficit. So there are still weaknesses. It's better to work with the Godly table windows rather than live on screen. At some stage, we'll get that fine-tuned, but at the moment, all our development efforts are going into to Ravel. So Minsky's a bit on the back burner right now. So there's deficit increasing deposits. What does it do elsewhere? How do you balance the row? And this is one of the great powers of double entry bookkeeping. It doesn't let you do just what you want to do. It forces you to do something logical. So I can't say deficit reduces loans, which would be crazy, or increases loans. The only thing I can say is it increases equity. And there you show the basic point of modern monetary theory, that a government deficit increases the equity of the private sector. And that's why I think I find this so powerful. Let's actually delete this spare row here, come back down here. So you're now seeing deficit spending by the government increases deposit accounts. It also increases reserves. And at the level of the non-bank sector, it increases deposits and then increases the net worth of the private sector because they've got an inflow with no liability. Okay. And that's the point of modern monetary theory. Now, if you look at what's going on here, I've got loans are turning up twice, deposits are turning up twice, the equities are independent, so they only turn up once, but reserves aren't turning up. So I've now got to bring in another table to show reserves. So if I click on bank icon, bring that down, right click, I'm going to call this central bank. Yeah. And save that, and I'll get into that in a second. Central bank, pardon me, I'll fix it up first of all. Yeah, Tarek.
Yeah, I wanted to know if spending minus taxation is the state's budget balance.
Yes, it is.
It is.
Yeah,
But
I could have said spending and taxation independently. And like if in the book, I start off that way, and then I say, well, you can just replace the two terms with one term and call it deficit. Of course, if you wanted to build a general model of the economy, then spending and taxation are both driven by different factors. So, for example, unemployment tends to drive spending, income tends to drive taxation. So you would have them as separate line entries, and you wouldn't run the fiction that I use in these simple models that the government can easily control the level of both. Okay, it's got more control over spending than it has over taxation. So these things become realistic constraints on what the government can do. But for a simple model, I'm just going to pretend that the government can run whatever deficit it likes. Okay, technically it can, of course, do that. They tend not to know it, but that's more in the shape. They've got more control over the spending side than they have over the taxation side. There's central bank. I'm going to right click and choose open its Godly table. And now what I've got is in reserves is an asset of the banking sector, which hasn't been made anybody's liability. If I click on the asset column, all assets are currently being allocated, so that is empty. But I click on the down arrow here for liabilities, the word reserves turns up, and I click on reserves and deficit comes across. Okay. So where does it come from? I could actually claim, and this is what MMT tends to do, they treat, pardon me, I should have put minus there. They tend to treat the government and the central bank as one unit, but that's only because they're not being, yes, they're being lazy, okay? Somebody in MMT should have invented Minsky, okay? I'm MMT, oriented, but I'm not seen as part of the MMT cognoscenti. But what they tend to do is lump the government together. And that's partly because it just makes it easier to do so. And I don't think they necessarily thought through the cascading balance sheet effects. But what I argue instead is we know the deficit is paid for out of the Treasury's TGA. And this is what Mano loaded shortly. So I'll just type TGA here, Treasury General Account. I'm going to cut that, come over here and paste it, insert the flow deficit as a minus. So what it's now telling us that the increase in reserves and the increase of reserves for deficit is caused by the TGA going negative. And if you were trying to model the central bank out of this, and you didn't have bond sales, then the TGA would go negative. Okay, but you've got government rules preventing that. Laws passed by governments that don't want that to happen. So we now have to bring in, to complete it, we've got to bring in the Treasury as well. So I'll go back to this screen. I'll put this in editor mode, drag this around a bit. I'm trying to make the tables roughly the same size. The big arrows are a bit messy to work with, unfortunately, but we're stuck with them for the meantime. So another godly table, call this Treasury. Right-click and open up its godly table. And then assets which haven't been allocated yet, TGA. There are no unallocated liabilities yet. This is Treasury. So what you can see, if we come back, and that means that the deficit is created by the Treasury going to negative equity. It just drops out extremely logically that that is how the government creates money, by running a deficit. And the deficit puts into negative equity. I'll just go back here and change this into editor mode so you can see the four together. So the deficit of the Treasury, which you see there, is equal to the positive entry for deficit in the non-bank private sector. And if you look at the other two terms in the non-bank, if you lump banks together with non-banks as the non-government sector, then interest and spending cancel out. And so the private sectors in general, the non-government sector, its equity is driven up by deficits, and the equity of the government sector is driven down by deficits. And that's the fundamental point of MMT. That's one reason I've got plenty of reason to get annoyed at neoclassical economists. What they're objecting to is accounting. It is simply accounting. That is all the fundamental ideas of MMT are. So they're saying accounting is stupid. No, I'm sorry. Economists are stupid. And it pops out that easily. Okay, Joe.
Is it fair to say that most of that equity goes to the banks?
No, that's not fair. You mean the private equity? This at the moment is only turning up. What I've got here, which is a bit of an abstraction, I've got the deficit just being spent on the non-bank public, okay, non-bank private sector. So at the moment, nothing of the government spending is boosting the equity of the banking sector. But when I bring bonds in there, that's what boosts their equity. So if you have interest being paid on bonds, and the banking sector and also non-bank financial institutions are the main holders of government bonds, the interest payment by the government puts the government into further negative equity and increases the positive equity of the financial sector.
Got it. Thanks.
Okay. All right. So we're getting it's ridiculous how easy this is to do. I mean, I can go right back to when before I developed Minsky, I got asked to run this course on managerial, what's it called? Not managerial economics, but public finance or something like that, University of Western Sydney. And the reason I was asked is the guy who was lecturing at the time was a neoclassical and it was a shithouse lecturer, and the students hated him. And there was going to be a revolt in the class. So I got asked to take it over to stop a student revolt happening. And out of that came Minsky. Okay. But at that stage, I had no idea of how to model money. I modeled debt. I could do that easily in my differential equations. But to tie in the creation of money, I had to read Graziani and say, that's the thing, that's this triangular relationship. Then I worked with Dwin Godley and saw him using the tables and thought, I can build the triangular relationship in the tables. And that's how Minsky came about. But if I go back, how far was that? 25 years, it's quite a while. I had no idea of how to do this. Now it's second nature. And Minsky just encapsulates all that wisdom, which is why my legacy is going to be software. Okay, I'll leave that for a second and go back to the presentation. I've probably been through a fair few points there that I wanted to do. So this is showing all the basic operations I've spoken about so far. Tarek, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to know what MMT economists mean by the consolidation hypothesis exactly.
Means they're being lazy. Because what they do is they simply say we lump the Treasury and the central bank together and don't think about what that implies in flows between the central bank and Treasury. Okay.
So there is
now,
a unique Godley table for the two.
Yeah, effectively. But they don't. I mean, I want MMT to use Minsky, but they make their arguments so much easier. Mano.
No, they don't always say that. There are people who separate and then for their own use, they consolidate to explain further points. To be fair,
I mean, I want them to adopt Minsky basically because it's the ultimate tool for MMT. So I'm a bit annoyed that there hasn't been widespread use of it by MMT advocates and champions. But it's partly just a bit like you guys. Before you saw me use the program, they haven't tried using it themselves, so they don't know. But once you start using it, I find Minsky addictive. I can't think in dynamics without running a Minsky model these days. And certainly looking at financial flows, there's no way that I'll make a comment before I built a Minsky model to check and see whether my observation is correct. Because, for example, if you want to model the fractional reserve banking model, you can actually say that fractional reserve banking can work, but the only way it can work is if all loans are in cash. Okay. And then you say, well, when was the last time you went to a bank and got a loan in cash? So it's not that it doesn't happen, it's that it's ridiculously rare. It might have happened a lot in the 19th century. It doesn't happen now. So at the very best, by talking about the money multiplier, the neoclassicals are talking about a 19th century model of banking. Mano.
Yeah, are you saying that, like, if you look at the Treasury General account, it accounts for cash also. If I take money out of the teller, that is reflected in the Treasury General account, I believe.
Oh, yeah, but that's actually like handling fiat money. So if you imagine, like, cash is obviously fiat money. But if a bank gave you a loan in cash, then that actually generates the money multiplier model. So I've done a model of the money multiplier in Minsky. And the idea is that what you effectively have is that you have the non-bank public depositing cash, let's call it cash, into their deposit accounts. And then, of course, the bank puts that in a vault. And then to lend it out, if you have lending out from reserves, reserves have to fall. The only way to balance that is that loans rise, but that means there's no actual money being given to the private sector. So you've got to show that on the private sector's Godley table. And what then happens is, as loans go up, so does cash. So what you have is the public deposits cash, the bank lends it out again and hangs onto a bit. As long as it's cash, what happens is cash remains constant, there's no change in the cash level, but loans rise over time. So you can generate it, but you then ask the practical question, how many loans are in cash? And the answer is pretty much zero these days. So, it's a typical zero model for the neoclassicals. But have a crack at it, see if you can actually work. That'd be, Tony, if you want to stretch your brain cells a bit, see, I won't give it to you. I'll leave this as an exercise. See if you can model fractional reserve banking lending in Minsky. Okay. Well, I won't do it now, but it's a little idea for later in the section. So this is just going through the whole idea of balancing the accounting. So what you have is government spending creates reserves and creates deposits, and government taxation destroys reserves and destroys deposits. So I've been through all that here. Okay, let's go through here. And then I've got tax and spend. And to model them, I simply made them some fraction of GDP. So I could do exactly the same thing here, and I'll do that now, actually. Let's go across to the model. So I've got deficit there. And what I can now do is take a copy of the, actually, I'll bring up the browser window. That's the easiest way to do it. There's a browser window. And if I click on deficit, I can then relate that to GDP. And I'll just change the scale so I see everything on screen at once. I've got GDP here. And I can just say that GDP deficit is some control parameter times GDP. So I'll first have deficit and then superscript percent and make that a parameter. Value of 0, but it can be anywhere from, say, up to 30% of GDP and down to minus, say, 5% of GDP with a step size of 1% of GDP. And I then multiply deficit GDP by deficit percent, fraction it really is, but that'll do. Now I control the deficit. So if I do that, let's just actually run the model again. So I've got no credit going on there at the moment, but I'll put the deficit in there. So here's the deficit. Take a copy of that graph and whack it up here. Attach the deficit up to here. Relabel that to deficit. And if I now run the economy, there's no credit going in. I've got credit at 0, I think. Yep, and I've got the deficit at 0. Nothing happens. But if you have deficit spending, yeah, GDP is 0. Doesn't help any, does it? That's my problem. What I'll do is I'll just actually delete that for the moment. And I'll do the same thing I did with credit. I'll give a range of the deficit from 0, started at 0 and give it a range up to 100 and a minimum of minus 100, let's say, and a step size of 1. And now if I run the model and have a deficit, GDP rises. If the government runs a surplus, GDP falls. Which again is a simple point of MMT, that deficit spending boosts the economy. Charles.
Steve, what I get out of today is that, I hope I'm right, this is the question. So if I would give you a monetary policy, you can prove whether it would work or not.
Yes, yeah. Monetary policy in the broad sense of government spending, interest rate controls, all those sorts of things. So the whole idea of Minsky is to have a sort of a silicon laboratory of the real world. And then you can say what you want to do, get the accounting right, and see what happens when you do what you want to do. And here what I'm showing is the government runs a surplus, it's going to reduce GDP. Now they think a surplus is going to improve GDP. If you read textbook economics, that's what they tell you. So it is simply saying if you understand the accounting, conventional economics is wrong.
Well,
in the book,
incredibly useful.
It's extremely useful, and I'd love people to use it, including giving. I mean, what you should do, mate, is kidnap half a dozen Treasury officials, tie them in chairs, glue their eyes open, and watch them make them watch a presentation. But they're trying not to see what I'm showing, and that's what I find so frustrating. They simply will not look at it, and that's one reason I call Minsky the monetary telescope, because they were literally back in Galileo's day when he'd invented the telescope, and he tried to get astronomers to look through it. They refused. They would not look down his telescope. They did not want to see that there were craters on the moon and that there are moons around Jupiter. Tariq.
I think that Mano.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's
Manos first. Okay.
Yeah, is it right to say when the spending is less than taxation?
Yes, that's
that
right.
should come out of private credit.
Yeah, well, not out of private credit. It comes out of the equity of the private sector.
Yeah.
Because what's happening is if you're spending less on the private sector than you're taxing, you're reducing private bank accounts. If we largely see that GDP is generated by people spending money, less money is spent, so GDP falls. Tariq.
Yeah, I thought that it would be easy to build a model which would prove that austerity policies does not reduce the debt GDP ratio.
Yeah, and in fact you can. And actually, what I might do, I think I've done like about 1.5 hours worth now. So what I might quickly do is go across and show how I put this together in the book I'm writing to show why the surpluses of the 1920s in effect caused the Great Depression, which is an argument that modern monetary theory itself makes, and I can make it. I can't quite prove it, but it's pretty damn reasonable. So just give me a second to find the right set of models here. So here's my model of what Calvin Coolidge did during the 1920s. And I really recommend reading Coolidge's 1928 State of the Nation speech. It's quite illuminating because he raves about how his surplus, and he ran a surplus roughly of 1% of GDP, how that caused prosperity. Now, what he didn't know at the same time, and this is again sort of very much a neoclassical thing, he had no idea what was happening to private debt. Okay, and in fact, private debt was growing 3 times as fast as he was reducing government debt. Yes, Herb.
I made a comment in the comments about how spending increases GDP, taxation decreases it unless the private sector is borrowing.
Exactly. And that's what you take a look at the data. What you find is, I'll actually set this up here first of all. Okay, so that's 0 and that's 0. If I run the model, as I've got it set up here, no change in GDP, well, very tiny changes. There's amounts of money changing in the accounts. So there's more money turning up in the banker's account. The growth rate is stabilizing 0.4% of GDP. But then if I have, oh, pardon me, I know why that's rising. I've got interest payments being paid on bonds, and government interest creates money for the financial sector. So I'm just going to turn that off. Got to find where I've got interest on bonds. Yeah, find where that's defined. If I right click, I can say find the definition, and then Minsky then zeroes in and shows me where it's defined. So I can then say, let's turn interest on bonds down to 0. And now let's run the model again, and there'll be no growth going on. Okay. And now if we set up the situation that applied during the Great Depression, during the 1920s, what you had was that, I'll actually zoom in there so you can see more clearly. I'm changing the size of the parameters there. So for really much the whole of the 1920s, Coolidge ran a 1% of GDP deficit. So that's 0.01 there. Okay. And at the same time, which he wasn't aware of, the private sector was borrowing roughly 5% of GDP. It's actually a bit higher on average. Let's make it 6. So I now run this model. You get GDP growth. And you get a positive rate of economic growth. And everything looks fantastic. And you can take the credit as the government for causing the boom. So see the growth rate there. I'll stop it at roughly, again, it's not stopping. Oh, it has stopped. That's good. Okay. So the 10-year rate, the growth rate is roughly 3%, just something like 2.94. Okay. So Coolidge thought that his surplus alone was causing that. He thought prudence and a lot of stuff was helping you out. What if there'd been no credit growth? Bring back credit growth back to zero. Same simulation. Negative GDP growth. What happens if he runs a deficit? 1% of GDP. Economic growth. So you can set up a model and simulate something which you can't control in the real world, and then answer questions about the real world that are impossible to answer without this telescope. So what caused the growth in the Great Depression was the level of credit. And I haven't actually talked you guys through this one yet, but I want to show you. Tell you what, do me a favor and shut your eyes for a moment. Close your eyes, as kids used to say to their father, including me. And what I'm going to show you is the level of margin debt in the 1920s. I think I've gone a bit too far there. There we are. Anybody wonder why the Great Depression happened? Margin debt went from 1% of GDP at the beginning of the 1920s to 9% of GDP at its peak, and then starting on the October crash, fell to 0.5%. And that's what wiped everybody out, because they'd all bought, not that all, but most of them had bought shares on margin. With margin back in those days, you had 10% deposit. So if you put down $100,000, you buy $1 million worth of shares with a $900,000 loan from the broker that you bought the shares through. And if the shares go up in value by 10%, you double your money. But if they go down by 10%, you wipe out your equity. And you can be required by a margin call to make it up. And you've got to sell anything to make it up. You have no limit. None of your assets are safe with a margin loan. That's why you'll see images of people from the 1920s selling a Rolls Royce for $10, or effectively that much money. And everybody got wiped out. Their equity was destroyed. And when I've done the numbers again through Rabble, and this gave me a shock. I've only just recently seen this. I'm going to cover this here. Here we go. Let's see. The rate of credit, negative credit, during the Great Depression, and I'm still getting used to believing this, peaked out at minus 35% of GDP per year. So the collapse in credit was incredible. I thought it was about minus 10. And when I graph over the very long term, including data from the 1800s as well, then you see this is the pattern of private debt and government debt. Private debt normally being much higher. A plunge in private debt in the 1830s, which gave you the 1837 Panic of 1837. But the plunge during the Great Depression was so deep that the rate of destruction of credit money was 35% of GDP per annum. That's what caused the Great Depression. And then the deficit, you can see the deficit hitting 30%. That's what financed the Second World War. And also it enabled the private sector to delever dramatically. So when we began the post-war period, debt had fallen from 150% of GDP down to about 30%, and it's now risen back up to 170%. But that's why the golden ages of capitalism existed. Low level of private debt. Most of your cash flow is going to buy goods and services rather than servicing your debt itself. That's what we need to restore. Of course, we won't. I think that's a good point to stop at, don't you? Okay. So yeah, an economy on the laboratory bench. That's the idea. The subject of the book is my approach to economics. They've like the contract I had to sign here for the BC4LS. And by the way, if you ever got a job offered a job in Hungary, and they ask you whether you get paid a pension, say no. Okay, saying yes cost me €10,000 a month. Please don't say yes. Say no. I'm still coping with the finances of that, but anyway, I'm still being paid a fabulous amount of money, but it could have been a fabulous amount plus 10,000. But anyway, they said I'd required to write one book of roughly 30,000 words and 2 blog posts of 3,000 words. So I'm focusing just on the book right now, and I'm calling it Rebuilding Economics from the Top Down. And it includes a lot of the stuff I've covered with you in these lectures. And there's actually a sort of a symbiotic relationship between the lectures and what goes into the book, because I'm including all the money creation, I'm including non-equilibrium dynamics, I'm including microeconomics with the cost structure of individual firms being constant marginal cost rather than rising. So all that's going into the book. So it's my mini magnum opus. It'll be about 50,000 words by the time I finish, I think, and it covers everything from why neoclassicals are wrong in terms of things like the theory of supply through to complex systems. And let's see, yeah. Any other comments or questions?
Hi, Steve.
Yep.
Yeah. So the Minsky, the way it runs is with initial conditions, it runs a continuous data input and simulates something, right?
Yeah, it's continuous time.
Yeah, I was asking previously whether it accepts discrete. Like you use Ravel, to and then operated with Minsky operators. You have done that.
Ravel is effectively for data analysis. Yeah, so it doesn't matter whether it's,
But I think you have used the Ravel data and used Minsky operator to add 2 columns or multiply by 2 and all that. You have done that, right? Yeah. And it's got all forms of other mathematics inside there. So all tensor mathematics is supported as well inside Ravel and inside Minsky. So, as of now, Minsky does not take discrete data to give out a discrete output.
Minsky, so long as I'm designing it, will never simulate in discrete time.
Not discrete time. Discrete actual data. Yeah, discrete actual data to produce a discrete output.
Yeah, you can input a data file into Minsky and use that as a lookup table. But generally speaking, Minsky is for modeling and Ravel is for data analysis.
Okay.
And Simon's asking, how's it different from debunking economics? It's actually all the positive stuff, the alternatives. So debunking was mainly trashing neoclassicals. This spends a bit of time trashing them, but that says this is what they should be doing, which is all the Minsky dynamic analysis and so on that I've covered in this course. Oliver.
Talking about the Great Depression.
Yeah.
Talking about the Great Depression. Is it reasonable to express that where you say private borrowing was down? Is it reasonable to say the banks withheld credit?
It's a combination of things. People took out loans which are margin loans, and then the share market crashed, which meant the equity they had was wiped out, and they could not meet those margin loans, so they were declared bankrupt. And then the bank took all their money, as much of the money they had in their bank accounts was gone. They liquidated their other assets. So banks were part of the whole operation, but banks also collapsed very widely during the Great Depression because, of course, back in the Great Depression, banks could buy shares. That was why the Glass-Steagall Act was brought in to stop that happening again, because when the share market fell, not only did the private non-bank sector start going bankrupt because of the decline in the share market, so did the banks. The banks went into negative equity. They had to shut down. So banks were certainly played a causal role, but they're also partially victims during the Great Depression. Joe.
I put a link in that I found recently on the relationship between raising interest rates and inflation. And it shows that the post World War II inflation was high for several years, but they kept the interest rates low. And the inflation eventually dissipated to the point where it was zero about 4 years later. So it's quite a challenge to the conventional thinking. Something else you can rebel against.
Reality is a challenge to the conventional thinking. What a waste of space it is. Oliver, you had a question.
Steve, I was just curious about your role in Hungary. Is that a fixed term contract or is that permanent? And what
I wish it was permanent. Pay rate, I
got?
wish it was permanent, but it's only 6 months. So it's going to last until the end of February. And then I've got to find something else. Because my Patreon money has been coming down quite radically over the last 4 years. Partly people dropping out, partly I think the cards system, a lot of people having their cards declined and then they drop off the list and I lose them. So I'm hoping I can have another income source by the time the 6 months ends. And that's partially what I'm hoping with Ravel. So I'm crossing my fingers. That means Microsoft will decide to swallow me. Have to wait and see. Otherwise, I'll be aiming to commercially release Ravel in maybe February, March. That's if we don't actually sell the IP, then we're continuing to improve the program to the point at which I can handle any data. Like I'm very pleased I got Manos data in very easily today, because often you try to re-import the data and you get an error message as Mano was getting, and it doesn't really give you an easy way around it. So we're trying to improve our flexibility of bringing data in, even when there are errors. Okay? That's partly the issue. Because one hassle with CSV files, you can type anything you like in a CSV file. So what is supposed to be numbers can actually turn out to be text. And then if at the moment Ravel would say, cannot handle this. But what we hope to say is, you want me to ignore the text and then bring in the numbers as far as they turn up. Equally, people can use different date formats in the one column on dates. So we're trying to get dates completely standardized as well. So enormous challenges to make it work so that it 100% excessive getting data into it, and then people can start learning how to drive it once they're inside. Anything else, or we're done? Okay, done. All right, guys, that's great. I'll go on to next week's topic, whatever that is. I'm not quite certain at the moment for the next week. So have a great evening. See you all Wednesday or Thursday next week. Bye.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Steve, just
Yes,
before.
yes, sorry, yeah.
Do I make my presentation on the Cobb-Douglas production function
next week?
Next week?
That'd be fantastic. I'd really appreciate that. Yeah.
Okay.
So Tarek, next week on the Cobb-Douglas production function, I might chime in if necessary on some of my critiques there. But that'll be talking about another thing where the neoclassicals produce garbage and think it's intelligence. Okay, night all. Thanks, Tarek.
Steve.
Bye.
Bye.